Thanks, Helen. Well, Helen's told you about quite a lot of the tax changes that happened in yesterday's budget. I'm going to be focusing on personal taxes and benefit measures. And there's quite a lot of small changes to personal taxes that I've not listed here, but some of the big ones were a giveaway in income tax with the Chancellor meeting the Conservative manifesto pledge a year early. The confirmation of a freeze in fuel duty rates for another year, confirming what the Prime Minister had announced a month or two back, and also some freezes for alcohol duties. On the benefits side, the Chancellor announced a couple of measures, or a number of measures, related to universal credit. Firstly, he announced the introduction of various protections for those who are being moved across from legacy benefits, the old benefit system, to UC. And that's aimed to ease that transition. He pushed back, or confirmed the pushback of the rollout of universal credit, the speed at which people get transferred over. And he also found some money for an increase in the underlying generosity of the benefit system. So let's look at income taxes. The Conservative manifesto was for the personal allowance and the higher rate threshold to increase to £12,500 and £50,000 respectively. The Chancellor's actually met that target a year early, but then he's frozen those thresholds for a year. Had he just let those thresholds increase in line with inflation, as they do by default, they would have reached those numbers you see on the screen there, £12,390 for the personal allowance and £48,590 for the higher rate threshold. So these are kind of modest giveaways. The personal allowance increase benefits a very large number of people, about 30 million taxpayers, and the higher rate threshold increase, not surprisingly, benefits considerably fewer, 4 million. But the size of those gains are quite different. A higher rate taxpayer is likely to see their tax liability fall by more than £150, whereas a typical basic rate taxpayer will see more like a £20 reduction. Taken together, these policies cost the Chancellor about £1.4 billion a year, and that's about half and half down to the personal allowance and the higher rate threshold. Now, the Chancellor made quite he mentioned about how he wanted to take more people out of tax and more people out of higher rate tax. And we can take a bit of a historical perspective on this issue here. So here I'm showing you the number of taxpayers and the number of higher rate taxpayers since 1990. Now, focusing first on that total number of taxpayers, the higher line, as a result of the policy announced yesterday, we estimate that that triangle there shows you the number of taxpayers we'd expect in 2020, 2021. So not too much different to if he hadn't announced anything. However, that increase in the personal allowance comes on top of really quite substantial increases that we've seen since 2010. Had the government just left the personal allowance unchanged in real terms since 2010, the number of taxpayers you can see there in that diamond in the top right would be considerably higher. So personal allowance changes since 2010 have taken about 6 million people out of tax. The picture for the higher rate threshold looks rather different. The policy announced yesterday will take about 300,000 people out of higher rate tax. But in contrast to the personal allowance, the government has reduced the higher rate threshold since 2010 by about 9% in real terms. So if they had just let the higher rate threshold increase with inflation, there would be considerably fewer people paying higher rate tax. In fact, 900,000 fewer than we now expect in 2020. So that's what I want to say about taxes. If we move now to benefits, the big changes here were related to universal credit. So universal credit, if you don't already know, is a major reform which brings together 6 means-tested benefits into a single payment. It doesn't solve all issues to do with, it isn't an unambiguous improvement in work incentives, but it does tend to get rid of the very weakest work incentives and in some senses simplifies the system. At the moment, there's about 1 million claimants of UC, and eventually that's expected to rise to something of the order of 7 million claimants, which represents 1 in 3 working age families, who together will receive something like £60 billion. Now, UC creates lots of losers, but also lots of winners, However, overall, it is a cut to benefits entitlements. The OBR think that it will actually increase take-up of benefits, which means that for some families, they will receive more of the benefits to which they're entitled, so that will represent an increase in income for them and a cost to the exchequer. And recipients who are moved over to UC from legacy benefits or old-style benefits are protected in cash terms. That's worth keeping in mind. But I'm just going to be looking at entitlements today. So the total amount that you're entitled to if you claim everything that you can and not taking account of any transitional measures. What did we learn yesterday about universal credit? Well, the Chancellor announced a few policies to ease the transition to UC, particularly for self-employed, the disabled, and out-of-work claimants. The rollout of UC got pushed back again, and that actually saves the government money. In fact, it saves them enough money to pay for the transitional policies mentioned above. And the Chancellor also found some money to increase the generosity of the system. So let's look at rollout first. Now, by the end of this year, this calendar year, almost all new claimants to working age benefits will get put on UC. But the date for existing benefit claimants, that big stock of existing benefit claimants to be moved over, has been pushed back again. And the OBR now expect that the full rollout of UC won't be completed until mid-2024. That's about 7 years later than the government initially hoped for. And you can see these plans for UC rollout on this chart here. And the government has persistently planned to roll out UC quite quickly, but the number of people actually getting onto UC has consistently disappointed, and yesterday was no different there. By 2019-20, so by next year, the rollout will only be about a third complete. But what happens when you do get rolled onto UC? Well, the system that you get rolled onto is now somewhat more generous than it was before yesterday. And that's because the Chancellor announced some giveaways in work allowances. The work allowance in UC is the amount that you can earn before your UC starts to be withdrawn. And this comes on top of a couple of other changes. So back in summer budget 2015, George Osborne cut the work allowances for the majority of families, representing a fairly large takeaway, including cutting to zero the work allowance for non-disabled families without children. So if you're a claimant and you don't have any children and you're not disabled, you see your UC reduced from the very first pound that you earn. 2 years ago, Philip Hammond gave a small giveaway in universal credit by reducing the taper rates. That's the speed at which your UC is withdrawn as you increase your earnings. And he announced another giveaway yesterday. Families with children or disabled claimants see their work allowances increase by £83 a month from this coming April. And that benefits about 2.4 million families by just over £50 a month. However, those claimants who don't have children, who aren't disabled, they still don't have any work allowances, and so they don't benefit from this policy. For others, for renters, it actually leaves the work allowance they have at higher than it would have been had none of these changes happened. But for owner-occupiers, it leaves it lower. So what does this mean for an actual claimant? Let's take a particular example. So a couple with 2 children, owner-occupiers. And what I'm showing you here is the amount of UC that they'd be entitled to at different levels of earnings. So their monthly net earnings, that's net of income tax and national insurance, on the horizontal axis, and their UC entitlement on the vertical axis. As you can see, if they have no earnings, they're entitled to a little bit less than £1,000 of UC. And as they increase their earnings, that £1,000 stays the same. They don't lose any of it until they hit about £550 or so. And that's the work allowance. If they have a £550 work allowance. And then above that amount, for every pound they earn, they see their UC withdrawn a bit. Now, before yesterday, that was what things looked like before any of these changes happened. Before yesterday, the system looked like that, so somewhat less UC, entitled somewhat less UC across most of the earning spectrum there. But taking into account what Hammond announced yesterday, pushes back the UC entitlement this family would have, but without going all the way. And so there's this particular example household would be no better off now than they would have been under before the summer budget 2015. Now, there are other types of families who actually would gain from this policy relative to before summer budget 2015, and other ones lose. But overall, the thing to take away is that between 2015 and 2018, the government made about £3 billion cut to UC in these policies, and yesterday they gave back about 1.7 billion, so a bit more than half. So a fairly sizable giveaway, but still a less generous system than the one back in 2015. Now, whether or not the Chancellor had announced these policies yesterday, the broader picture is that still UC creates a very large number of winners and losers, and this policy doesn't fundamentally change that. And creating lots of winners and losers is a fundamental feature of radical reform. If you're bringing together lots of different benefits and you're keeping the overall spend sort of in the same ballpark, you can't really do that in a way without creating winners and losers. So let's look at how many there are in these categories. So what I've done here is I've looked at the current UC system, the new UC system as it will be given the changes yesterday, and look just at those families who are entitled to some benefits and see what proportion of them gain or lose different amounts. And so of those entitled families, around a third lose at least £1,000 a year as a result of moving from legacy benefits to UC. That means about 2.4 million families, quite a lot. There's about 20% of families are essentially unaffected, seeing only less than £100 change a year. And then there's a considerable number that actually see quite large gains from UC. 1.7 million families, or about a quarter, gain at least £1,000 a year. We can break this out by family type. Broadly, what you see here is that for those in work, almost all of them gain or lose something. Those grey bars are very thin, and those with children are particularly likely to gain. But for those out of work, very few gain, and there's quite a large proportion that lose fairly substantial amounts. So far we've been talking about universal credit, but universal credit is just one of the tax and benefit reforms introduced since 2015. So here I'm going to put that alongside other reforms. So if we just focus on universal credit first, here we've got the population ranked by poorest to richest, split up into equal groups of 10 equal groups. And you can see universal credit represents a takeaway from those at the bottom of the income distribution. That's actually mostly because of just one part of universal credit, which is essentially very ungenerous to low-income, self-employed people. And then you can see some other takeaways further up the spectrum. Now, I've just told you about how UC creates quite a number of winners and losers. That's true here as well. Here we're just taking the averages within each decile. But when you compare those averages to the average effects of other policies, you can see that these other policies are also having a substantial impact on people's incomes. The two-child limit, which reduces benefits for those with at least 3 children, and the removal of the family premium, which essentially reduces benefits for anyone with, any claimant with children, also represents a substantial takeaway. And other tax and benefit reforms, the most important of which is the benefits freeze, at least for those at the bottom, also represents a large cut in incomes. And it's worth just re-emphasizing that often people talk about the two-child limit and universal credit as if they're sort of one and the same or together in a particular sense. They're really better thought of as separate policies. Even if the government cancelled universal credit tomorrow, the two-child limit would eventually be brought in. Now, if we take the net effect of all of these policies announced since 2015, that's that black line you can see there. That's what things look like now, the effect of policies since 2015. What did it look like before yesterday? Not a whole bunch different. In terms of the overall pattern, we still see broadly the same changes. So there's small increases across the distribution. We can actually we can kind of zoom in on those increases. What exactly has the budget done to people's incomes? So here I'm looking at the differences between the black and the orange lines. And that you can see here in the bars. And in broad terms, those who are towards the bottom of the income distribution see sort of modest gains, particularly those in the second and third decile. And we also see some gains in cash terms, quite large gains at the top. Now, all of what I've been talking about now has been the long-run impact of these policies. But quite a lot of the policies brought in since 2015 come in quite slowly. So we can look... Oh, except that chart's disappeared. Well, I'll just tell you what I was going to share. Since a lot of policies which have been brought in since 2015... Oh, no, I see it. There it is. Here we go. A lot of policies which have been brought in since 2015 aren't fully rolled out yet. And so you can basically see this here. If you focus on those light green bars and look at that 2018 light green bar, you can see it's quite a bit smaller than the bars, some of the bars which follow it. And that basically means that there's quite a bit more in terms of benefit cuts in the pipeline, to the tune of about £4 billion a year. And so there's still quite a lot more to be done. Okay, so bringing everything together, we've seen a modest giveaway for income taxes, which especially benefited those who pay the higher rate of income tax. And we've seen a number of changes in UC. Protections introduced might ease the transition, though they're fiscally quite small. They might make quite a big difference to individual families. But the timings of those transitions, where people do move, have been pushed back again. The chances given away increase the generosity of UC by increasing work allowances, and that partly undoes some of those previous takeaways. But there's still many winners and losers, and that fundamentally isn't really changed. And there's also many other benefit cuts since 2015, only some of which, and of which they're only partly implemented. So there's much more to come on that front. Thank you very much.